I never thought parking my own car in my own driveway would lead to police lights, shouting across the lawn, and a full-blown neighborhood meltdown. But that's exactly what happened the day I brought home my new Tesla Model X. The moment I pulled into my driveway, feeling proud and honestly just excited to finally own a car I'd worked so hard for, I saw her standing there, arms crossed, eyebrows already raised. The infamous HOA Karen. If you've ever dealt with a nosy neighbor who thinks she runs the block, you already know how fast things can spiral out of control. But this went way beyond any petty complaint or passive-aggressive note on the mailbox. She didn't just confront me about the car, she marched right up, demanded to know if I had permission to park a luxury vehicle on a residential property, as if my driveway suddenly belonged to the HOA. I tried to stay calm. I really did. But things escalated fast when she whipped out her phone and dialed 911 like I was committing a felony just by existing. And that's not even the craziest part. Within minutes, she actually stood in front of my garage, physically blocking me from pulling in, insisting that she was preventing a violation of the HOA rules. Mind you, I'd checked the bylaws. There was nothing in there about EVs, nothing about garage parking. She was clearly making it up as she went. But the way she acted, the things she said, it was like she believed she had full legal authority over my property. So now I'm standing in my own driveway with a brand new Tesla, an angry neighbor yelling in front of my garage, and the sound of police sirens getting louder. You won't believe what happened next and how far she was willing to go to try and prove a point. So while I'm standing there, trying to stay calm, Karen keeps pacing in front of my garage like she's on a mission. Her tone was sharp, and she kept repeating that, "This kind of vehicle doesn't belong in our neighborhood." I couldn't wrap my head around it. It's not like the Tesla Model X is some sort of eyesore. It's clean, quiet, environmentally friendly, and it's mine. But for her, it wasn't about the car itself. It was about control. She seemed bothered by the fact that I hadn't gone through her or informed the HOA board, even though, again, there was absolutely nothing in the rules about owning or parking an electric vehicle. And this wasn't the first time she had overstepped. I'd only moved into this community about 4 months earlier, and I'd already seen her leave warning notes on neighbors' lawns about grass length violations and make comments about trash bins being out too early. Most people just rolled their eyes and ignored her, but I guess something about my Tesla really pushed her over the edge. A few of my neighbors started peeking through their windows. One guy across the street even stepped out with his phone, probably thinking the same thing I was, this is about to go viral. Karen noticed the attention, but didn't care. She pointed at me, then at my car, shouting, "You think you can just roll in here with your fancy car and not follow the rules?" This point, I wasn't even sure what rule she thought I was breaking. And then came the real twist. When the police pulled up, she ran toward them like she'd just saved the whole neighborhood. What she said to them next actually made my jaw drop. I couldn't believe the story she was trying to spin, and I knew right then this situation was far from over. As the officers stepped out of the squad car, Karen rushed up like she'd just caught a criminal in the act. She pointed back at me and my Tesla, breathlessly telling them I was disrupting the peace and refusing to follow HOA regulations. I stood there stunned. I hadn't even said more than a few words to her before she called 911, and now she was spinning this dramatic version of events like she was some kind of neighborhood protector. The officers looked confused but calm, one of them asking me if I minded explaining what was going on from my side. I told them the truth. I'd just pulled into my driveway after a long day, parked my Model X, and was immediately confronted by her. No noise, no party, no issue. Just a neighbor furious about a car she didn't like. While I was talking, Karen kept trying to cut in, waving a rolled-up copy of the HOA guidelines she must have grabbed from her house mid-drama. She kept pointing to vague sections about community aesthetics and vehicle standards, none of which actually said anything about electric cars or garage use. Meanwhile, more neighbors started gathering outside. A couple who lived 2 houses down came over and whispered to me that this wasn't the first time she'd called the cops on someone for violating HOA culture. Another neighbor, John, quietly told one of the officers that she once reported his daughter for chalk drawings on their sidewalk. The picture was starting to form, and it wasn't a flattering one for Karen. But the real twist came when the HOA president showed up. I hadn't even known he lived a few doors down. He looked serious and didn't say much at first, just stood back and listened as Karen tried to pull him into her side. She thought he'd back her up instantly. But when he turned to me and asked for my version of events, I could see something shift in her face, like she realized her grip on this situation might not be as tight as she thought. Still, the tension in the air was thick. She wasn't backing down, and I could feel this wasn't just about my Tesla anymore. This was persona. The HOA president, Mr. Lawson, stood there quietly for a moment, flipping through the same printed HOA packet Karen had been waving around like it was a badge. You could feel the silence spreading. Even the officers paused, waiting to hear what he'd say. Karen was practically shaking, not from fear, but from the pressure of needing to be right. Her whole sense of power in the neighborhood hinged on this moment. She leaned in and started pointing to a section titled Property Appearance Standards, rambling about how a high-profile vehicle like my Tesla Model X disrupted the visual flow of the community. It sounded absurd, but she said it like she was quoting law. But instead of agreeing, Mr. Lawson calmly asked her where exactly in the guidelines it said anything about electric vehicles or garage usage. She blinked. For once, she didn't have a ready answer. You could see the gears turning in her head, trying to reframe her argument. That's when she pivoted and accused me of bringing down property values, then added that I'd parked inappropriately earlier that week, something no one else had mentioned until now. Just as I was about to respond, one of the police officers stepped away to take a phone call. Turns out, someone had anonymously reported a dangerous situation involving an aggressive driver and a suspicious vehicle. My heart sank. That couldn't be a coincidence. Karen must have called it in that way to make it sound serious enough for a fast response. Now the energy shifted again. The officers looked tenser, more alert. One started quietly circling my Tesla, checking it like it was some kind of threat. I felt like things were slipping. My neighbors were whispering. The president looked uncomfortable. And Karen? She had that smug look back on her face. I realized she didn't just want me in trouble. She wanted me out. Out of the driveway. Out of the HOA. Maybe even out of the neighborhood. And the worst part? I still didn't know what she'd do next. But something told me, whatever it was, she wasn't finished. Not even close. L for her. And she was ready to take it even further. Just when I thought the situation had reached its peak, one of the officers came back over and asked me to step aside so they could verify a report tied to my license plate. My stomach dropped. I knew my Tesla Model X was registered, insured, and completely clean. But the way the officer looked at me, cautious, almost suspicious, told me something had just shifted. Karen stood nearby, pretending to look concerned, but I caught the smirk she tried to hide. That's when it hit me. This wasn't just about HOA drama anymore. She had gone a step further, and I had no idea what kind of false report she might have filed behind the scenes. The officer explained that the call they'd received described a vehicle matching mine being involved in an alleged hit-and-run earlier in the week, right near the same neighborhood entrance. I couldn't believe it. It was obvious someone had intentionally described my Tesla. I told them I'd had my car parked at my workplace all that day, and even offered to pull up the footage from the Tesla's built-in dashcam system. One officer nodded, but the other looked like he wasn't sure whether to believe me yet. Karen was watching all of this unfold with that same twisted satisfaction, like she'd been waiting for the moment someone else took over her fight for her. As I tried to explain my side, Mr. Lawson stepped in, asking the officers to slow down and review the facts. But the damage had been done. Neighbors who'd previously been silent were now whispering louder. A few stepped back. One even took their kids inside. I could feel my reputation slipping, not because I did anything wrong, but because Karen was playing a longer game than anyone realized. Then, out of nowhere, another voice chimed in from the crowd, a woman I didn't recognize. She said, "Actually, I saw the whole thing, and that's not the guy you're looking for." Every head turned. Karen's face went pale. The officers froze. Suddenly, the whole conflict had a new layer, and none of us were ready for what was coming next. All eyes locked on the woman as she stepped forward, calm but firm. She introduced herself as Michelle, a new resident who had just moved in a week earlier and happened to live across from the community entrance. "I saw the car involved in the hit and run," she said clearly, looking right at the officers. "And it wasn't a Tesla. It was a dark blue SUV. Older model, definitely not electric." One of the officers asked her to describe it in more detail, and without missing a beat, she rattled off the make, model, even part of the plate. That level of detail left no room for doubt. The officers exchanged glances, nodded, and one of them stepped aside to radio in the update. Meanwhile, Karen stood frozen, her face drained of color, her jaw clenched so tight you could practically hear her grinding her teeth. Mr. Lawson turned toward her slowly, disappointment written all over his face. "Karen," he said, "did you report that hit and run yourself?" She didn't answer, but her silence said everything. The officer returned and confirmed the update. They'd just been told another unit was already tracking the actual suspect vehicle. They looked at me and apologized for the confusion. I could finally breathe again. I nodded and said I understood, knowing full well this wasn't their fault. But Karen's plan had collapsed, right there in front of everyone. Just as the tension started to fade and people began walking back to their homes, Michelle added one more thing, something that flipped the whole situation on its head. "Actually," she said, holding up her phone, "my doorbell camera caught everything from earlier too, including Karen yelling at him before the cops even showed up. Should I email it to the HOA board?" Karen spun around, eyes wide, voice shaking. "You were recording?" Michelle didn't even flinch. "My camera records everything, always has." The crowd that had almost backed away now seemed glued to the sidewalk again. Karen, who had once ruled the block with passive-aggressive notes and late-night complaint calls, suddenly looked a lot smaller. And while the main conflict was over, something told me this wasn't the last time I'd have to deal with her. But now, she wasn't the only one with evidence. The officers took Michelle's contact info and thanked her for stepping in. That doorbell footage turned out to be the final piece that cleared everything up. They assured me there'd be no further issues and left soon after, clearly realizing the whole situation had been blown way out of proportion. Mr. Lawson stayed behind and apologized for how things had played out. He told me the HOA would be reviewing Karen's behavior, especially given the false report and the way she tried to manipulate both the guidelines and the police. It wasn't just a neighborhood squabble anymore. She'd crossed a serious line. Few neighbors came by afterward to check in, even offering to help if I needed to file a complaint or take it to the HOA board. Honestly, I appreciated that. For the first time since moving in, I felt like people actually saw what I was dealing with. The Tesla Model X had nothing to do with it. It was just the trigger for someone who was used to control and couldn't handle change. Over the next few days, things calmed down. Karen kept to herself, barely stepping outside. Michelle and I ended up chatting more, and she's actually been a solid neighbor, smart, level-headed, and not afraid to speak up. The HOA did eventually send a formal notice out, reminding everyone that false reports and misuse of HOA authority could lead to consequences, though they didn't name names. Looking back, I realized it wasn't about a car or HOA rules. It was about respect, boundaries, and standing your ground when someone tries to push you around. I bought my Tesla to celebrate a milestone in my life, not to spark a neighborhood war. But in the end, it reminded me that no matter how quiet the street looks, you never really know what's waiting around the corner until you park in your own driveway.